Now, hey everyone, glad you're tuning in. It's been a few months anyway since we did the Wednesday night artist show.
3 weeks, 4 weeks.
3 weeks, 4 weeks. Yeah, seems like much longer. Mikhail, who's already on, he actually was just giving me gears about that the other day about how we it's been a while. So, thanks for tuning in, and we've got a very special guest, Troy. I don't call him a guest anymore. He's host. He hosts. But we have Mr. Brandon Graham. Brandon, how you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. We chatted a little bit tonight, guys. Same as always, keep it pretty casual. Troy and Brandon will kind of, we'll shoot the shit, talk shop, keep it nice and casual. And anyone watching, let's chime in. Let's hear your thoughts. Let's hear your questions, and let's go from there.
Yeah. So just up front, Brandon and I have known each other for 5 or 6 years now, like just personally, since when we both lived in Vancouver, I guess. That was about 5 or 6 years ago. So we chat occasionally. And instead of sort of, not that these things are ever formal, but I usually have some questions or areas pre-planned that I thought would be good to discuss, but I didn't put that together tonight because I just thought Brandon and I would talk about some of the things that we do talk about, maybe get into things a little more about process, which I always find really interesting. And but just sort of talk about comics and why comics.
Certainly.
And why comics. And because I was thinking about this earlier, and anyone that doesn't follow Brandon should follow Brandon, just even if it's just for his Tintin coverage on his Instagram stories, which are quite brilliant. But it made me think that you are one of the few artists who still reads a lot of comics.
Yeah, it's part of my working process. I don't, if it's not comics, it's some kind of reading and watching stories. I mean, I think everybody watches film and reads books and things still, but it's like, I'm very entrenched in the idea that comic books is its own thing and that it's a very untapped medium in a lot of ways. And more recently, I've started to feel like people are reinventing the wheel. I think there's so much great work that's been done in the past that, it's amazing. I've devoted my life to reading comics, and then I am discovering new artists constantly, and going back and digging through. I've been doing Tintin rereads, and recently I started reading Harvey comics again, and a lot of it's me going back to the very first comics that I. There's an Inky Bilal book where a guy is trying to remember the day he was born. And I feel like I've been trying to do the comic book equivalent of that.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, because you were posting some Richie Rich stuff as well. And I read all that Harvey stuff too as a kid. I never liked Richie Rich though. I like Casper, which probably speaks to my supernatural stuff that I enjoy, but I never liked Richie Rich and haven't read it in forever. So what's Richie Rich up to these days? Still being the rich kid?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of amazing. So I think I got back into it because a friend of mine showed me the Macaulay Culkin Richie Rich movie. And I was just like, I don't want to see this. But first of all, Macaulay Culkin is a charming child actor. I stand by that.
Yeah.
And I think with Richie Rich, they are aware, on some level, they must be aware of what they're dealing with. So they actually are like, we have to make this character likable and charming despite, and they also don't treat him it's written, more so the comics than the movie, but it's kind of written by people who have no understanding of money at all.
Mm-hmm.
One of the constant things in the comic is that he's always building things out of money. They'll be like, oh, we need to get across this bridge. So they'll build a bridge with money, sacks of money.
Yeah.
Or they'll have a driveway that's all gold coins. And it's they don't understand that you can just put it in a bank. Richie Rich has a kite that's made of $100 bills. It's you could buy a kite. And it's that nonsense is so funny to me. It's it has that broken logic
I always like to think of Richie Rich, and I don't. I just thought of this right now, but I always like to think of Richie Rich as if Bruce Wayne's parents actually weren't killed, and that's just life. That's just the life that Bruce Wayne had as Richie Rich.
I mean, I feel like you could make an argument that Richie Rich does more good for the world than Batman.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's very true. Yeah,
Like he doesn't beat up anyone unless like he's attacked. You know.
It's funny because those Harvey comics, reading them, because I would have been reading a lot of Archie and stuff at that time too, because my sister actually loved Archie when she was a kid. So I never bought Archie, but there was always like the double digests on hand and stuff. And I always thought that even that as a young kid, that the Archie comics were more sophisticated than the Harvey comics.
Like I think they're supposed to be.
Yeah,
I've been reading about how that's, not to cut you off. I was reading about how it's kind of a gateway to from like people like the Harvey comics were made for readers that then went on to Archie and Marvel and DC.
Yeah, well, and
that's what you're saying.
But when you were younger, because for me, I never thought of in terms of age. It's, you know, to me, comics were just entertainment, and some were better than the others. And I just didn't think that, oh, Harvey, you know, isn't as sophisticated because it's meant for people younger than me. It was just comics. I came into comics in a really weird way. It was Mad Magazine and Tintin when I was a kid. Like those are the first comics I read. So, you know, very different things, probably skewed older than I certainly would have been, but I didn't understand, like I said, the age thing. So
sure.
So was it Harvey that you were reading as a kid, or were you consuming everything?
I mean, my parents read comics, so I had a weird, like, Freak Brothers was around a lot when I was a kid, and Spider-Man. Oh, wow. Yeah, I always say that my mom had a letter published in Spider-Man when she was in college.
Did she really?
Yeah. I haven't found the actual letter, but I should actually ask the issue. Yeah, so the comics were always around. Like, I have no pre-comics memory, but it's like, it's very easy for me to focus on, like in the past, I've always been like, well, Heavy Metal Magazine was always around since I was a kid. And it was, but like, I couldn't tell you if I liked that or Richie Rich more when I was 10, you know?
It's, and it's funny because as you were consuming all this stuff, because I didn't have that, it certainly wasn't frowned upon. Like my mom was the one that was buying me Mad Magazine. This is like no one else was attracted to any kind of cartooning at all. Like I was huge. I was a huge consumer of newspaper cartoon strips as well, which is why I still have a real soft spot for them, I guess. You know, so it was just anything that I could get. But I always thought creatively in terms of cartoons, because cartoons were like Bugs Bunny was everything for me as a kid.
Okay.
So when I drew, even though I was reading comics, I never thought of storytelling in terms of panels. I would just draw sequences. One time my dad brought home this huge roll of paper and I just started drawing and just literally drawing the story, thinking in terms more of animation than comics. But I mean, I was drawing comics just incorrectly.
Who's the artist that they found all of his work kind of post-mortem? Is it Harvey?
The guy. He's really interesting. There's a really good documentary on him. I think it's on YouTube, and he's the one that drew and created this massive work of these little like it was little girls with penises. Yeah, little girls with penises. But I was thinking but they had wings and stuff. What's cherubs? I was thinking of
it's very bizarre. And and there are all these. I've seen the originals. They're on these gigantic scrolls.
That's right. He did. Yeah, he did work like that as well. Yeah, and he just was completely self-isolated. Like no one knew that this stuff existed.
Yeah.
And I guess that if not for some common sense, that maybe you or I could have gone in that direction as well.
There's still time.
Yeah, well, that's true.
Yeah, but just that idea of if that's where your brain goes initially, where it's just like a story, it's just this endless strip of things.
Mm-hmm.
Makes me think of that. Do you know the Pat McEwen story that he ran in the back of Weasel?
Yeah.
It's called No Escape, where it's just
Yeah.
it's a comic book that, excuse me, the panels are essentially rooms of the building they're in, and you don't read it left to right. You kind of follow different characters as they go upstairs and elevators and things.
And doesn't it sort of begin at the beginning and the end, and it sort of meets in the middle?
I think there's multiple places that it can end up. I used to have it, I think somewhere in storage, I have it printed out on a scroll just to go.
Oh, okay.
Because initially it was printed like a 10-page thing, and you can read it backwards
Yeah.
and forwards.
Yeah, that was pretty incredible. I met Pat a couple of times in Vancouver. He was living on the island then. I don't know where he is now. I know he's still close with Dave Cooper.
Mm-hmm.
But he sort of just sequestered himself a bit too. He wasn't really that interested in growing any kind of comic community. And I think he ended up in animation, I believe.
Yeah, no, I follow him on Instagram, and he posts.
Oh, is he on Instagram now?
Yeah, I'll have to send you a link. But
yeah,
he's one of those. Yeah, it's weird. There's all those kind of artists that are. I think of it as a Tom Herpick. Is that type? Do you know Tom's work at all?
No, I don't.
He's one of the major. I think he's the guy who storyboarded more Adventure Time episodes than anyone else.
Oh, okay.
And he's done 3 books in print through alternative press. He did Gondwanadon and Cusp and White Clay, I think was his 3rd book.
Okay.
And he's just this, he's like Pat McEwen good. This amazing cartoonist who just is kind of outside of the conversation because, for whatever reason, because there's always guys like Al Columbia that has like Columbia. I don't know if he has 3 books to his name, but most people know his name. Or,
it's almost sort of the myth of Al Columbia. There's so many stories about him, and who knows how many of them are accurate or not. Doesn't Robin know him a little bit?
Yeah, I've met him as well.
Oh, you have? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I know he's supposed to be a new book is supposed to come out this year, I believe.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. Yeah, he's one of those guys too where I think with someone like Pat, who is hugely talented, but I think that his work is a little more inviting in terms of subject matter, whereas with Al, he very much is challenging you to want to enter, but maybe you don't. So readers are probably sort of creating their own mythology around Al. I know that I certainly have.
Yeah, well, it's funny because I feel like you kind of fall in that similar wheelhouse of bizarre, like interestingly uninviting work sometimes.
It's true. Someone referred to the people I draw as sacks of potatoes. I think that's what they said.
Okay.
And I didn't know if I couldn't tell because it was written, so I was reading it. I couldn't tell if they meant that as a compliment or not, but I took it as one.
It's funny, the picture of mine that's up here is such a sack of potato guy on the left there.
Oh, and Cam left. It's there forever now. No, it's interesting though, because as you are still consuming lots of comics and books and stuff, and I've certainly got back into reading comics after some time away. Like, how is that working for you now? Like, is it really informing what you're working on now, or is it just sort of scratching that itch of consuming storytelling? Or
no, it's really informative, especially like the Hergé stuff. The Tintin comics have been like, I've noticed it's really dramatically affecting how there's a stripped down quality to the way Hergé tells the story sometimes that I find really freeing. He often does this thing that I think of as a European style panel where it's the characters are standing directly on the panel border. And it's a thing that I think technically doesn't really work in perspective, but it works in a drawing. Yeah. And because it's this weird thing where it's like the ground is, it's like the ground is here and the characters are here. And then you have someone in the background and it's just like back here, whatever, as bad as I'm describing that. But yeah, it's like that is just a very simple way to show something. It certainly showed up in my work a lot. And like reading the Harvey comics, I've actually been writing down my sketchbook, like I'm like, why do I like these? You know?
Yeah. Well, it has to be the art more than the stories, I'm sure.
I think it's started because I'm the kind of person that if the writing's not there, it kind of falls apart for me.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So there's something there in terms of the story that you're getting from it.
I mean, some of it is just like sometimes I enjoy comic books because they're weird and they go in weird directions. You know, like sometimes it's like watching a movie that's so bad it's good.
Yeah, I never discover those movies. I'm such a movie snob that those don't ever.
That's the problem is you've directed too much and you know too much of how it works. And, but I mean, there's weirdness sometimes. Like sometimes I find myself writing things because I always go back to the first issue of Prophet that I wrote with Simon Roy on art. I'd watched the Jim Jarmusch movie called The Limits of Control, I think.
Oh, okay.
And there's a scene in it where the main character goes into his hotel room and he's supposed to have a meeting with this beautiful woman, and she's just naked on his bed, and she's like, "We'll have a meeting, but first, before we get to business, make love to me." And I was watching that, and it's supposed to be this like very European thing, and I was just like, this presumptuous woman, like maybe he doesn't want to have sex with you. But I was also just thinking like how funny it would be if just like middle-aged businessmen all operate that way. Like, all right, let's get the sex out of the way so we can talk about the Johnson account.
That's right.
Anyway, it manifested in Prophet. I just had a weird, they called it the vagina chicken, but it was this horrible alien that was basically a chicken with like a genital face. Like gives the main character this thing and then they have sex, and it's just kind of this weird scene for the sake of being weird because I was trying to show how culturally different stuff was in the comic.
Well, and that's the thing is that depending on who finds your work, comics is either really forgiving or completely unforgiving. And I think a lot of that can be in the terms of presentation and who the publisher is. You know, we've talked about this before where I'm very thankful for the opportunities that Mike Richardson has given me over the years, but I don't know if Dark Horse was the best place for my work, because I think that people come into, yes, Rodney, I think people come into certain expectations with publishers, and because my work is what it is, that it doesn't sort of fall under a normal sort of Dark Horse umbrella, and so it can kind of push people in weird ways.
Yeah, but where would your work make sense?
Yeah, that's the thing. I don't know if it.
Like I feel like a book of yours should be like attained like a gremlin, where you go into some weird shop and they're like, "I'm not supposed to sell this to you."
Well, and I think that we've talked about the possibility of Kickstarters and Patreon and just dealing directly to fans, and it's working for some people now, and I think that is an approach that would work for me in terms of, well, if you're a fan of my work, you know what to expect, and then it emboldens me even more to push myself in the areas where I've sort of held back. And I've been open with you in terms of the last two projects I did with Damon with Vinegar Teeth, and then even just myself on the latest Trout material, was that I was trying to, keep one foot in sort of the weird world and the other one in more of a commercial world. And it just wasn't as strong as they could have been as a result.
Okay. I always have to remind myself, I have this, one of the things that I run through my brain a lot is when I look at my past work, I'm like, that's the best I could do, or maybe that's what I could do with the circumstances.
Yeah.
And sometimes that involves like, I was trying to make something that actually people wanted to read in a way. And, because I mean, like going back to Prophet, when I worked on that with the guys, Simon and Yanni and all those guys, I would read reviews all the time, and I felt constantly pulled back and forth with people like, I didn't understand this issue. So we'd make very clear next issue. And then I'd read it again and be like, I don't know if this is like pandering too much to like, there's a Monkey Punch quote, the guy that did Lupin the Third manga, where he talked about how he doesn't worry about his comics being too accessible because people can always flip back and read it again.
That's it. But there's the expectation that hopefully they will do that.
Yeah, but because I think we probably all read comics where it's not worth it, where you're like, this is just confusing and I don't care.
Yeah.
But I think the goal is to make something that's engaging enough where if there's something a little confusing, people want to go back. Like I've been thinking a lot about, I always think about Masamune Shirow's book Appleseed.
Yep.
Somebody I'm always talking about how influential it was on me and how much I like it. And somebody contacted me a while back and they're like, I picked up Appleseed because you always speak so highly of it. And I think I got a bad translation because it doesn't make any sense. And I was like, nope, that's it. You know?
That's the one.
Yeah.
Well, and it's funny because I really enjoy Appleseed more than I appreciate and enjoy Ghost in the Shell, which is of course his, which is the project everyone knows him for. And it's interesting where, to me, Appleseed is far more sarcastic, and Ghost in the Shell is a funny book. That's the thing. Like if you watch all the movies and the anime, you think it must be a really serious work, and it got a little more serious as it went, but it was goofy. Like he's famous for writing all those sort of snarky remarks in the gutters and stuff. It's amazing.
Yeah, they get kind of cartoonish eventually. There's one part, I think it's in the second, my least favorite Shiro book is the second Ghost in the Shell. It's mostly done on a computer. And it's got a part on one of the opening pages where it's like a down shot of two airplanes flying over a character on a boat. And it has this block of text just like, well, actually, this is not how airplanes would fly if no information. And it's just like, yeah, it's a comic book. Get over it. Imagine reading a Richie Rich and they're just like, actually, he wouldn't build a bridge out of money.
That just wouldn't work structurally.
Yeah, exactly. But I feel like I do a lot of work to stay out of my head in that way, so you don't write little notes like that.
Yeah, well, exactly. And it's interesting, though, because getting back to sort of reader expectations and, specifically with your work, like, do you expect the reader to do some work when they read your stuff? Or, because certainly, like, the big complaint with Marvel these days is nobody has to do anything when they read this stuff. Like, it's sort of a story about something that's leading to another story that's sort of about something.
Yeah. There's a lot to unpack there because I feel like I put a lot of thought into how you introduce a reader to a story. And I think there's ways you kind of teach a reader how to read something. It's like you can start reusing the same insignias and be like, this means this, and then it can mean something interesting later on in the story. But kind of on the Marvel thing, I've been thinking of going back and reading old comic books and even reading early Marvel. I was doing a thing for a while where whenever the new X-Men comics would come out, I would go read, like the third X-Men book would come out, and I'd go back and I'd read the old Lee Kirby issue number 3 and compare the storytelling in them. And that was really fascinating because I realized that I think one of the big values of monthly comics is getting a beginning, middle, and end in one issue.
Mm-hmm.
And not everything works like that or has to work like that, but I feel like if it doesn't go anywhere ever, then you kind of need that. You need you want closure, at least if it's just on the story. But I think a lot of it is just how a reader gets into something. There's a manga called Walking Man that I like a lot, which is just a series of short stories about nothing.
Yeah, and I keep meaning to look that up because I was sort of really fascinated about that when you told me.
Yeah, and there's something really like if you start a comic and it's just a character walking down the street and it's really hot and then they stop and get a soda, it's like very easy way to I did a diary comic about this last year, which is basically apparently someone told me this story, so I can't back it up, but apparently there's a Japanese game show that has where the point of the game show is you have to wake up a sleeping person and see how quickly you can get them to eat a hot dog.
That sounds like a Japanese game show.
Yeah, and I was thinking about that in relation to storytelling, where it's like a giant. I always say like one of my least favorite ways you can start a comic book is just with like a block of text, like page 1, just a block of text, someone behind a podium, and obviously there's exceptions, but like it's almost like that's a hot dog first thing in the morning. You're like, Jesus Christ, don't talk, don't give me that many words right now. But if you know, it's like someone wakes up and you give them a glass of water and then like have a coffee and then, you know, here's some eggs or whatever. Yeah, and I think that's, you got to think of storytelling that way too, where it's like you got to give someone a reason to care about the stuff before you give them homework.
Well, and I mean, and that's exactly it. It's interesting because I have been reading a lot of manga lately. Is it Tatsumi? I've been reading Tatsumi, the Drawn and Quarterly books they put out of his.
Okay.
Have you read any of his work?
I'm not sure.
So Pushman is one.
I've read Pushman. Yeah, that's depressing. It's just like post World War II dead baby comics.
Yeah, and this is like Abandon the Old in Tokyo is the one on the shelf that I just recently finished. And so, you know, this is sort of the beauty of the medium, because that really couldn't exist in any other storytelling form. I mean, you couldn't do a collection of short stories that are that bleak and miserable.
Yeah, they're so dark.
No, they are. It's just like the one story, this man was feeling so miserable that he needed to experience a physical pain, the level of which he was feeling inside. So he goes and he has sex with a dog.
Oh, yeah, you're open there.
Yeah, you know, and and his stories just end. Like there's no sort of, there's no redemption of his characters. It's just, this is what happens. Like, this is just, a few days in their really miserable lives. And he's really interesting. Is Adrian Tomini? I believe that's how to pronounce his last name.
Sure.
He is sort of responsible for these coming out in North America.
Oh, I didn't know.
And so he does interviews with him in the back of the books. And he's sort of largely forgotten in Japan now. He actually owns a used bookstore. That's what he does for an income. And
did these run in Garo originally?
I don't know. For years, he worked as a manga artist for, there's a term that's escaping me, but basically it was like rental manga. So you could go in and rent manga really cheaply, so it wasn't the normal manga that you would get from, book publishers. It was sort of produced very cheaply, very quickly. And he did that stuff for years and years and years and years. And so he sort of developed a work ethic through that, but also sort of a really different perspective in terms of creating stories. And you read the interviews and he doesn't sound like a miserable old man, or he's married. And I guess Drawn and Quarterly brought him over to San Diego Comic-Con when the first book came out, and people were really excited to meet him. And both he and his wife were shocked that there was a huge lineup for autographs. They were just overwhelmed by it. But yeah, really interesting. I mean, if you haven't read them, they're certainly not for everyone. I mean, this is sort of, like I said, the beauty of comics, that they don't need to be for everyone, and these are certainly not. But and you read them very quickly. Like, they are just collections of short stories. But
yeah, you read Barefoot Gen?
I did years ago, and I don't really remember it.
I mean, it's just a guy basically doing his kind of fictionalized personal reenactment of what it was like to be around Hiroshima when the bomb hit.
Oh, okay.
And so it has there's like a horse on fire and like people are melting and all this stuff. And I feel like Pushman is like that for adults.
Yeah. But this is what I think is so fantastic about comics. And I wanted to talk to you about that. I don't think that cartoonists really push the specialness of comics enough. I think that a lot of times we're just sort of very, we're happy to create. Maybe we're a little, because we're still thought of really far down the totem pole in terms of important in regards to storytelling mediums. And comics certainly doesn't get its due, and it's such an amazing medium to work in. You know, it's incredible. It's so uniquely its own thing, as you suggested earlier. And it's like you yourself or me, like we can just sit down and create something.
Yeah, it's a weird environment because it's like I feel like so much of the focus, and I feel like I take a lot of responsibility for this. I feel like I focus on the dumbest aspects of comics, which are like what the sales part is talking about, and not the most exciting things that are going on. A friend of mine was asking the other day about, like, he had a very bleak idea about where art was right now in the world, and I was pointing out to him all the cool things I was discovering that are going on that just people aren't talking about. You know, like I feel like so much of like the conversation in comics communities that I am in are always like focusing on the negative,
Yeah,
and focusing on what's selling and not focusing on the like weird, exciting stuff in the cracks.
well, and it seems like too much of the opinion of comics is reflected in Twitter. Like somehow Twitter is the voice of comics, and it's nonsense. Like you go onto Twitter and you read anything comic related, and it is like it's just so miserable.
And so I did a whole podcast about it with the ink pulp guy, and it was just
With Sean.
with Sean, yeah, and Sean Crystal, and I like when I quit Twitter, it was like a detox, and now I'm just like I feel like I'm out of the fucking. I feel like I've left Scientology or something. It's just the dumbest, worst place for your brain, and all the opinions on there are garbage, and just like I heard a comedian describe it as just like giving everyone you hate your phone number. You know?
That's
so,
awesome.
yeah, it's insane. I feel like there needs to be more of an attitude of like Twitter has to be treated as kind of a fanny pack of conversation. Like it's just it should be embarrassing to people that they go on there.
Yeah. Well, and so much of what's, and they're always bemoaning the fate of the comic industry, but comics is a medium. I mean,
Yeah.
that's like saying music is going to disappear. Like, no, it's not. There'll always be people creating comics, and realizing now, sort of like I've been at this for it'll be 30 years next year. Is that right? Something like that. Anyways, a long damn time.
Sure.
And I've never really felt like I was in the comic industry, even though I worked for established publishers. I wasn't doing what a lot of people do. I did conventions sort of early on, but I haven't done conventions in decades.
Sure.
And I just sort of did my own thing, and it's almost to the point now where it's like, oh, I think that is sort of the future for me, anyways, is to really push into just doing my own thing, and whether that be a Patreon or whatever it is, like direct marketing stories to people rather than going through a publisher through this really antiquated distribution system. Because really we create something that is easily distributed. Why go through a publisher, distributor, retailer when you can just go right to the person, who is interested in your work?
Yeah, it's certainly. I feel like nostalgia has been the major reason why I often do that. And I have a nice relationship with my publisher, but I also feel like I've been thinking a lot about how I'm trying to think of print more as like the vinyl equivalent in music,
mm-hmm.
and then maybe I've been thinking a lot about putting out work directly online. Are you familiar with this guy Thomas's book, Kill 6 Billion Demons?
Yeah.
Yeah, like I think that's
the first
really
one
cool
somewhere over there.
Nice. Yeah, but he releases that thing for free on his website, just for anyone to read, and it's incredibly Jeff Darrow, James Stokoe detailed.
Yeah.
And then he puts it out in print, and he has a Patreon that a ton of people follow, where they basically have video chats like this with him every couple weeks, and he kind of exists outside of the comics conversation while doing some of the most exciting work being done, I think.
Well, there's almost something to separating yourself from the noise to hear the quiet so you can hear your thoughts properly,
Sure.
And to me, that's what's really amazing. Like, I've been very open about my love of movies, and I would love to continue to be directing movies. That didn't work. That's
Sure.
fine. But film is a very collaborative medium. Like, you have to rely on other people to get stuff done. Like, obviously. But with comics, you don't. And so somebody like sorry, what's his name again?
Thomas.
I mean, he's created his own universe, his own world.
Yeah.
And that's what I think is really special about comics is, an author, could write that description, but you're still relying on the reader to visualize it. Whereas Thomas is like, boom, there it is. It's like I'm giving you everything you need to know in this big, huge, massive double-page spread.
Yeah, I think, even looking at this picture, it's like this thing where I feel like you'd want to own this in print. Like, it's not.
Yeah.
It's not. It doesn't quite do it justice to see it on the screen.
I was sort of liken musicians to cartoonists more than I do any other sort of creative medium, because really you can put yourself in a room and you can come out with a product that you've created all on your own that evokes emotion, which is the whole point of creating something. And, so that's why I think that there's sort of a real specialness. I keep going back to this, like, sort of the individual voice being able to create this. And,
sure.
And with you especially too, like, nobody's doing what you're doing in comics.
That's the hope. It's always funny because I always have these moments of, I feel like some of the things that I've arrived at feeling very personal about work is when I thought I was getting outdone in my own, I guess to explain it better. Do you know Grandpa's work, who just did the book with Frank Miller?
Yeah.
Is it Raphael Grandpa?
Yeah.
So years ago when he first started, he put out his initial book, and then Dark Horse announced a book called Furry Water, I think. It never came out, but it had these amazing, he did a couple pages of it. It had these characters with these gigantic scissors. They had scissors that looked like swords, basically. You probably find, Cameron can probably find art for it online. But I remember seeing that and being like, God damn it, that's exactly what I want to be doing with the Multiple Warhead series I'm doing. And his book never came out, so I never had a reality of what his book would have been like. I just had this idea of, like, I'll never make something as cool as this. So I had something to kind of strive for, which I think was really helpful.
Well, and it's interesting because, it's no knock against it, but his work doesn't really resonate with me.
Sure.
Like, I can look at sort of the prettiness of it, but it doesn't go really deeper than that for me. Whereas with your work, King City, I think, was the first thing of yours that I picked up. When I found out that you were living in Vancouver, I was like, oh, who's this Brandon Graham guy? And then I found your book and I was like, holy shit, this guy lives here. And
yes.
I was blown away. Like, I love it. It's a book I still really love. And,
sure.
And then with the idea of, like, oh, well, I'm sure I'll meet him someday. And it might have been at one of Len's shows where I can't remember where I first met you, but,
right.
Yeah, to be able to go, and for anyone that hasn't read it, is it still available? Can you still?
Oh, yeah.
People should definitely
in the newest previous catalog.
There it is.
Yeah, well,
that's Multiple Warheads. Do you have King City there?
Oh, I do. It's just on my bookshelf.
Oh, that's all right.
No worries. Yeah, because King City, I made this. The publisher had this great trick where they, it's this gigantic phone book of a thing, and they put it out for $20. So it's like, I think it's the most pages, one of the most pages per price of anything Image publishes.
Yeah.
Which I kind of feel like you kind of have to when you're like, before you're talking about, like, working with a publisher and how it's perceived. And I kind of feel like if you're being published by the same, like, if it's like, by Saga or Walking Dead or this book by someone you've never heard of, you kind of have to be like, well, look at this brick that I've done.
Yeah.
It almost requires you to bring a little bit more.
Well, it's funny with that book too, because every book, when it has a sticker that says price is different in Canada, you can almost guarantee you're going to pay $70 for that book, even though the list price is like $29.99 US. Except King City, I was dumbfounded. by how inexpensive it was. Because I think it's $19.99 for the whole thing, and I think it ended up costing me less than 30 Canadian. So
that's awesome.
It's a steal. Yeah.
But you've had a long relationship with Image, and there's certainly a company that, if I was to try that route again, Image would really be interesting. I think the hesitancy I have with Image is just the sheer volume of books that they put out.
And I think I was talking to my editor there yesterday. Image has editors now, which is a whole new thing.
Wow.
Or at least I am.
Yeah. So is that? Can you request an editor? Is that what you can do now, or?
I think so. Yeah, I think they have in-house editors now. The woman I'm working with is Shauna, and she was my production artist beforehand, so it's incredibly helpful because that's always a weak spot for me, is understanding how printing works.
Wow. Is Shauna who did she do the production stuff on Island?
She did, yeah.
Oh, then I know Shauna, yeah, because I chatted with her. She helped me on my story because I screwed mine up, and she saved my bacon.
Yeah, she's a cartoonist herself, and was manager of Floating World, the comic store in Portland, before she worked at Image.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, she's been super helpful and kind of talking through editing stuff, and I think she's editing like 10 books now, and they're bringing on other editors. But I forget where I was going with bringing up talking to her the other day. I just about the idea of kind of I got the impression, I don't know how much is speaking out of school here, but I kind of got the impression that she was that Image is generally trying to like kind of be more selective about the books they're publishing, because I feel like they've hit this spot where they're kind of become Marvel and DC's Vertigo, where they're like, you expect, which is certainly not my scene. Like I probably have some regrets about never dipping my toes in Marvel and DC, but I also don't think I fit there.
I wouldn't say now. I would say, perhaps there was a time at DC when they were getting people like Dave Cooper to do Wonder Woman stories, where you would have very easily fit in at that time. And I think they're going to cancel most of their books. I don't know what's going on there right now.
Yeah.
But
well, I don't know if it's boring to talk about, but yeah, I think DC's going towards the children's market much more.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny because then speaking about, that's actually really intriguing to me that they actually have editors now. Because that was the one thing too about why I feel comfortable sort of putting my stories together. It's always nice to have someone on the other end that is facilitating that workflow, yeah, it feels a bit like a vacuum. And the thing I'm working on now, like I'm 200 pages in, and it just makes me feel like a crazy person when I'm like, does this make any sense? Yeah, well, that's good. That's good to have that on the other end to go, well, you're crazy, but no, the story is amazing. Right. So are you putting that out? Are you going to serialize that, or is that going to come out as one big book? It's serialized with these giant, 50-page issues. Okay. So it's 5 issues, 250 pages, basically. Is Image, are they open to doing different sized formats and stuff, or are they still very much sort of the, Yeah, no, I think it varies. I mean, a lot. I mean, the main thing is kind of what retailers are interested in having, Yeah. I did a thing where after Island, I started doing, if you look at the first and second Multiple Warheads books next to each other, they're like slightly different sizes. Because I realize if I move, I have a cat here too. This is Waffles. Hey, Waffles. I realized that if I just printed it slightly larger, it kind of pops out on a shelf, but it's not big enough to annoy retailers. Yeah. Well, that's always been the frustrating thing. And I mean, I understand that. I mean, their stores are designed a certain way. But as a creative person, you always want to experiment. Like I had a retailer tell me that he didn't order books if the title treatment wasn't on the top, because the way that his shelves worked is you basically just saw, the logo. So
Right.
if you were experimenting, you put the title treatment on the bottom. He wasn't going to order the book unless, of course, it was like an issue of X-Men or something like that. But he just had no interest in it. He just, was not thinking outside of just, what he needs to sell, and that's it,
Yeah, and I think it's really good to talk to. Waffles does need his own camera.
His own Insta account.
I think it does. Like I go into the comic store. I go into Cosmic Monkey every Wednesday and talk to those guys a bit. And it's funny. The picture that's up was RX Comics, which is my old comic store back in
Vancouver.
Yeah, which is now 8th Dimension, I think is the name of it.
Yeah.
I actually went across the street of the comic store and just sat there and penciled that.
That's awesome.
Because I would always have these moments where I was like, when I lived in Vancouver, I lived kind of right at the corner of like Main Street, and it was just this. I would always find myself being like, oh, when I'm drawing King City, I can just go outside and draw the neighborhood. And it was so much nicer.
What's so amazing about this is that across the street, so close to where you would have been, was one of the last film.
Adult movie theaters.
Adult movie theaters, yeah, where they actually still showed movies on film.
Yeah. Do you know Robin Bougie?
Yeah.
Yeah, like he's always. To anyone that doesn't know his stuff, there's this thing called Cinema Sewer, which is an amazing magazine on kind of 70s B movies and adult movies and things. And I think of him as like the mayor of Vancouver.
It would certainly take a different direction if Robin was mayor of Vancouver.
He produced a biblical themed porn movie at one point called The Coming of Jesus.
Oh, jeez.
Which I always have to bring up whenever I mention it, because that exists.
Is he still married to Robin?
Rebecca.
Rebecca, sorry.
Yeah, Rebecca Dar, who's one of the main designers, I believe, on My Little Pony.
Yeah, but she's incredibly talented. So you take that My Little Pony out of the equation, because I'm sure everyone's immediately thinking My Little Pony, but she's she's very talented. Yeah, Vancouver.
I think that's Bougie's face on the tray there too.
Yeah, that looks like his face. Yes, that's him. Yeah, it's interesting where stuff like his magazine can exist. I mean, it certainly is its own thing. It's certainly not for everyone.
Yeah,
it's a very specific audience, but
I think kind of going back to what you're talking about with retailers, I kind of feel like that's the goal. Is like, you don't want to have to deal with someone that's like, you printed your comic book logo in the wrong place. You want someone that's just like you want readers and retailers and in general people interested in stuff that are just like, show me something I can't get anywhere else. Because if you can make a movie about it, then I think like one of the things that I think the Marvel movies really did is they just kind of showed people that like you can make this stuff for everyone. But I think it really creates a lane where it's like, what can't you do in a Marvel movie? What's too personal and what's too kind of unique to not be for everyone?
Yeah, well, no, it's very true. And so because of, wanting to experiment with some different formats, and I have for years and years, but it's always come back to, what we were just saying about retailers and what they'll order and what they won't order, and also what publishers are willing to print.
Sure.
And
that's huge.
Yeah, and so you are essentially handcuffed to a certain extent if you're just going through a sort of standard model of publisher to distributor to retailer. But it's good to know that is sort of changing. I mean, even with DC doing their Black Label, is that what it is, Cam?
Yep.
Yeah, the sort of more European format size.
I joke about Black Label being, it's very frustrating because I was excited about Black Label being a thing, and I think they've done some interesting stuff there, and they continue to do some interesting stuff, but just the cartoonish version of how it was essentially like, this is DC Comics for adults, and then everyone just lost their shit when Batman's dick showed up. Yeah. It's just like, well, clearly there's no adults here.
No. Well, in age, yes, but on their birth certificate, driver's license. But yeah, it is interesting where they tried, they were doing some different things, but once again, then it's sort of the expectation of readers to a certain extent with North American comics, for sure, and what they want and what they don't want. And of course, that's not everyone, because there's a lot of readers who like to be challenged and who like different material, but a lot of those sort of Wednesday warriors who go in and they don't even look at what's on the shelf. They're just like, they get their pull file and then they make sure they get the mint copy, and then they walk out the door.
Yeah.
Like, you're never going to sell books to those people. Like, it's just
Yeah,
never
I think
going to
it's
happen.
worth just being like, yeah, those people are not your people. Well, there's a weird thing with comics where people try to focus on kind of getting all of the medium to a better place, and it's just like, I think we need kind of singular work that is very much more exciting than just I should tell the story about the Cinema Sewer cover I did. The idea there was that it was two of the Gem and the Holograms misfits in a Duckburg, like Scrooge McDuck prison.
and can you ascertain that from the information on the cover?
Probably not. It was just like what I do.
Oh, there's Duckburg. Well, he's got Duckburg County on the back, though.
Yeah, he's got Duckburg County, and there's a Beagle Boy on her shoulder.
Oh yes.
I'm surprised I didn't do any jokes on the numbering there. But like before, when I was talking about kind of the importance of story to drawings for me, it's like I have to tell myself stories to even finish things. Like I can't draw a cityscape without like thinking about what's behind every window.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's the intent of what you're doing. Yeah, I mean, like, you see it a lot where people kind of wow you with an image, but then there isn't anything supporting those structures. It's like the fake fronts in movies. It's like, oh yeah, the building looks amazing. You walk in and you just see the 2x4 structure on the other side of it. You want to be able to then go in and it's like, well, why did you draw this amazing cityscape? Like, what's the reason for it? And that's sort of always pushing me lately in terms of my writing, where there has to be, like, it's all very character driven stuff. And I mean, I probably have 5 or 6 things in different stages of writing, where it's like, okay, I need to put this away for now because I kind of wrote myself into a corner, and where I was going was fine, but where I need to go isn't, and I need to figure it out.
Sure. And
it's all sort of very personal in the sense that it's always one sort of character driven story. Like you're basically in the back pocket of one character and you follow them through the story. And so, certainly I get to wrap it up in my usual weird trappings, but now I'm really pushing myself for the stories to exist beyond just what you're reading. Like, there's a lot more to it. Maybe you have to really work to figure it out. Maybe you never will, but that the intent is there. And I feel that with your stuff as well.
Yeah, and it's funny that you can sometimes tell a good story, hopefully, and not, like, the reader doesn't really need to know what it's about.
Yeah.
And I get so caught up in the minutia sometimes of like world building stuff that lately the story I'm doing is so kind of far away from normal Earth stuff that I've been kind of allowing myself like to think of things as the emotional, like, what's the emotional point of this drawing, as opposed to like if I'm drawing someone's eating dinner and they have a fork. I'm like, well, I don't know if they'd have a fork in this weird future alien society, but I don't need to think about that. I just need to convey to the reader that they're eating, And so it's almost good. Like this. What's that?
I was going to say, but it's great that you go to that extreme, at least initially, where you're thinking about that stuff, because that stuff does resonate. Like, as you add more and more to it, like, you really are creating something dynamic to a world beyond just what the characters are doing.
Crazy.
Well, that is true as well.
I beat myself up I had a thing in Prophet once where the character said okay, and I was like, they wouldn't say okay, and I had to get to this point. Like, it took me days to be like, the English wouldn't be recognizable in this. They would have. Yeah, I'm basically just writing a translation of what they would be saying. and just like that nonsense that goes through my head when I have to kind of step back and be like, it's a comic book. Nobody's going to look at it and be like, I don't think a society would develop that way. You know.
So when you start off working on something, so we can talk about your new project sort of more abstractly, so we're not giving anything away. From what you told, it's I love the idea of it. The conceit of it it sounds amazing. But do you tackle it just first in a broader sense before you start breaking up and how you're going to do it? Like, do you get vague ideas that you start to put together, or like how do you set off drawings or words first?
Well, it's funny. The next thing I'm working on, which I don't really have a title for, but the series I'm working on after I finish the series that I'm working on now that hasn't come out yet, that I'm probably like 6 months away from starting. That thing actually started because I was doing so much research about story structure, and I basically was trying to think of like, what's the best way that you can put out a short episodic story? Because I was thinking like police serials are really good at there was that book Fell that Ellis and Ben Passmore, is his name, put out. It was like the 16-page self-contained issues.
Temple Smith,
that's it. Sorry.
Yeah.
Ben Passmore is a completely different animal. But Temple Smith and Ellis put out this book that was like these very short self-contained issues, and I was studying those a lot and just how successful they were at getting these very satisfying self-contained issues, and I realized the police procedural is really good because having a character the detective is really good because you already know like you don't have to explain to the reader every issue. Like, this guy's job is that he has to solve a crime. It's just that he has to solve a crime. So I created this thing where it's basically a character is given a mission every issue. He has no control of the mission. And he's just in the story I'm doing, he's being blackmailed, and basically like a box shows up every morning, and they're just like, you have to go to the desert and dig up a truck and drive that truck somewhere. And then the fun with him doing that in 20 pages. And then I was trying to think of like a way to take that story and build towards a larger story. So he doesn't know why he's doing this every day, every issue. But the idea is that like after 6 issues, it becomes clear that he's like doing this thing that kind of works like a Rube Goldberg machine to kind of like, knock the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And then something happens and then he has to deal with the consequences of that.
And so it's the same character through every story.
Yeah, it's 2 characters, but I'm allowing myself to have a lot of fun with it. Like, I've got a cafe in it, which is just, I haven't drawn any of this yet. It's just the idea. Like, the idea was just, it's a giant Bridget Bardot, just like leaning on her side in the middle of Manhattan. And you just go and get coffee from an old lady that sits in front of her. And just like things that I'm like, what would be fun to draw,
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing. Like, so much of what you can get away with in comics is hard to do, like in film, for instance, because you have producers who are demanding you explain everything.
Yeah, and I think that's the major thing, is not like having to explain everything and just being like, I'm doing this because like I never want to get rid of the feeling of like I'm getting away with something. Like, I'm doing this because no one is going to stop me.
Well, and that's the beauty of it, and it's funny because that it feels very much like Tintin has found its way into this new project you're working on.
Usually,
yeah, it feels very Tintin-like.
And the main character, like, I was reading a lot about how Tintin, people like, there's a theory that people like Tintin because he's such a like blank slate. And so the main character, the thing I'm working on, he literally, you never see his face. He's wearing a mask the entire time, which is basically like a sock with 2 eye holes. And when anyone asks him about his past, he bursts out in tears. And it was this thing of like kind of taking the Tintin thing to the extreme, because Tintin doesn't have a family really. He like, you see his apartment early on, but then he just like moves in with Captain Haddock and lives in a mansion. Yeah. And he's like 15 all the time. There's no parents to sign off on it. It's just this weird abstract. And so kind of leaning into that, I think, would be really fun.
Well, and it's interesting because, I mean, he's got a dog. And I mean, I think that when, yeah, and I think that when he was created, he was supposed to be like every young boy's sort of aspiration.
Yeah, he was kind of like a Boy Scout character.
Yeah, like the 10-year-olds wanted to be Tintin. And it is quite fascinating that it still resonates now. And I think it's because it's so beautifully drawn, and the stories are, there's lots of adventure. The characters are wonderful, and the timeless stories are timeless for a reason.
Yeah, and it's also something I like a lot about is how he breaks down. Like, it's really made for kids in a way that I really admire, where he'll be like, oh, we've got to do this. There's a thing that's important to the story, but it's not going to be that much fun to read. So he finds a way to like have a vase fall on someone's head while that's happening. And I feel like that's something I've been trying to learn a lot from, is just like, how do you make scenes fun by themselves?
Well, and there's always that, and I mean, I keep going back to movies. We're talking about comics, but there's always that rule of burying exposition and action. Mm-hmm. So if two characters have to have, a few pages of dialogue to either catch the viewers up, or if the viewers are ahead, to catch the characters up to where the viewers are. Do that during a car chase, or like a bank robbery or something, right? Yeah. So that you're actually visually watching something as you're getting this, boring information. And you certainly can apply that to comics, and so it's exciting that you're sort of really starting to introduce that. I think maybe I should go back and read some more Tintin and see what happens.
Yeah, they're fun, and it's also really fascinating to read the history around them, like, because Hergé was very interested in kind of following the reality, and like when he did the Blue Lotus book, that he worked with a Chinese sculptor, art student, a lot to kind of get it authentic, and they talked a lot about what was going on politically in China. He kind of started doing things that were much more in line with where the world was at, and then World War II happened, and Germany occupied Belgium, and so suddenly he had to kind of whistle and continue to make Tintin and be like, what war? So there's these Tintin books that just exist, like ignoring World War II. So World War II doesn't happen in Tintin. Then Tintin and Snowy and those guys are the first people to go to the moon, and then the moon landing happens while Tintin is coming out, and they just ignore it. They're just like, yeah, we already went to the moon, So it creates this alternate timeline. It's really fascinating.
Well, and it is funny to sort of go back and look at his history, Hergé's history, and because I think some has come out. He's like, oh well, he's not a great guy. There was some of this and some of that, and I mean, how much of that is just very much at the time? You don't want to dismiss everything, but it's just, like you said, like he's living in an occupied country,
Yeah, and I generally my general opinion of that stuff is always to approach like I didn't know the guy, and also, I mean, it's a long, messy conversation to have, but I feel like, it's hard to know how people would operate in occupied Belgium as cartoonists. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like a bunch of Hergé's peers who are cartoonists got put to death. And I'm sure they would have drawn different comics if they knew they were going to be killed by their government.
Oh, I'm sure. It's crazy to think that could be a consequence of their creativity. And yeah, I mean, but it's interesting to see how he still was able to separate that from his work and just continued on creating these, very sort of high adventure, with slapstick comedy, but he was really good at balancing that.
That's something I admire a lot, is he kind of pulled Tintin, like, regardless of what anyone thinks about Hergé, I'm really fascinated that he made this worldwide comic while being branded essentially a Nazi sympathizer in post-World War II Europe and being completely blacklisted, and he pulled Tintin out of that. It still became a worldwide phenomenon.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's very admirable, regardless of, because I mean, I personally think that Hergé was growing as a person his whole life. Like, as much as I've read in interviews and in his work, I feel like he was somebody who was kind of figuring out what the right thing to do was as he was doing it. And I think he was a better person in 1960 than he was in 1930.
Yeah.
Or at least his work was more conscientious of people different from him.
it's interesting too to sort of see where he falls in line, or or in place with sort of modern cartoonists. And I think that a lot of younger cartoonists are finding their influence through Japan, especially.
Oh, sure.
There's a huge ton of manga influence in young artists' work, or European artists, but I don't know if I necessarily see a lot of Hergé's work, in younger cartoonists.
I think there's still Mobius shows up a lot, and I don't think you get Mobius.
Yeah. Do you follow, like, so when you're reading comics, do you read a lot of books by younger creators as well as older stuff? Or
but these days I'm especially fascinated by Michael Sweater and Benji Nate's work. They do a lot of works with Silver Sprocket, and they're both really fantastic cartoonists.
There's some amazing new is it Baloney Feathers? Is Sophie, is that her name? Oh, now I need to look. She is like my favorite new cartoonist. She's amazing. Just brilliant work. Excuse me a moment while I look it up, because I want to give people her.
Yeah, but there's so much interesting stuff. I went to the comic store today. I got the new Craig's new book.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, just very, very excellent cartooning.
Sophie Franz is her name. She goes by Baloney Feathers. I think she's absolutely remarkable.
I should look after it. I'm always like, who's that? And then I realize I'm following them.
Yeah. There's another one that I found recently. Jasper, and I'm going to probably butcher his last name. Jasper's his first name. Jubenville? So he's from Vancouver, actually.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, he's 20. And he is so far ahead of me when I was 20.
I'm so cynical about kids, too. It's really funny because, like, I feel like not to shit talk anyone, but I feel like it's almost easier to find a brilliant 20-year-old than like an amazing 60-year-old, because this life breaks you.
It seems that way, doesn't it? It's just, and it's so wonderful looking at their work, because they are like, and I don't know how old Sophie is, but there's just so much knowledge in her work, and you're just like, wow.
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
it's really quite remarkable. And so you wonder, it's just like, well, I mean, is she just sort of an outlier who's brilliant, or is she just able to really absorb, because there's so much information, is she able to absorb it and process it? It's just, but it's, I mean,
my worry is publishers not like catching up to this stuff and like grabbing people, because it's very easy to fall into animation, and I don't know if that's a bad thing, but it's like, I think the frustration oftentimes with animation is like, it takes so many people in film and animation to make things, is that you don't get his personal work oftentimes.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's so labor intensive, and so, well, I mean, you storyboarded, you wrote and directed an episode of Adventure Time, and you said that was the equivalent of doing how many issues of a book? You said it was a lot of work.
It was a lot of work. It was like, I mean, I didn't really know what I was doing initially, so it was like, I got a kind of co-storyboard and wrote it. And Adventure Time is an interesting way of working, where they give you a rough outline that's basically like bullet points, and then you storyboard that and do all the jokes kind of in between. And I think that kind of allows for much more personal, like a much more personal view of things. They kind of change the style to fit your art a little bit more.
Well, you certainly can tell. Like, you can tell that you're involved. There's a lot of Brandon Graham isms in it, for sure.
That's weird too, because like I find animation to be less. I think I'm less excited about the medium. Like, it's fascinating, and it's weird. It's weird to me that I don't know everything about it. Comics, I feel like very much in control of it, because I can figure out the printing and everything. With animation, I remember asking, like, so this is getting sent over to Korea, and then someone else is going to redraw all my drawings? That's weird. you know, and it's cool, but it's so different from like I really like the process of drawing a line and then a recreation of that line being what the reader sees.
Yeah, well, exactly, and I mean that's the thing with film and animation for sure, is that yeah, your ideas are on display, but they're facilitated through someone else. You know, where
Yeah,
they're
they're
actor, production designer. You know,
Are you familiar with Robert Valley's work?
no.
A friend of mine was showing me one of those like Love, Death, and Robots or whatever they're called.
Oh yeah, which one is his?
He did one like kind of like about a blue robot guy.
Well, I watched it so long ago.
Valley's really, it's a guy that turns out to be like a pool cleaner.
Oh yeah. That one's awesome.
Yeah. And that guy also worked on, I think he worked on Gorilla stuff, and he worked on he's a Vancouver guy initially, I think, but he worked on the Gorillas, and he worked on, there was a Wonder Woman animated short that he did. There's a Chronicles of Riddick animated thing that came out probably almost 15 or 20 years ago now, and it was directed by Peter Chung, who did Aeon Flux. Yeah, and had my friend Phil Barlow, who did Zooniverse and like the Extreme Ghostbusters designs.
I love Phil's stuff.
Yeah, he's fantastic. He's on there, and then Robert Valley they brought in just for a knife fight scene. So it's like everything's very Peter Chung, Aeon Flux, and then there's one knife fight scene that just goes like incredibly stylized. And it's fantastic.
And it's funny because that's
he designed Tron too.
Oh shit!
The Tron cartoon.
Oh, Tron.
This the new they made a Tron cartoon that's really good.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, sorry, what were we saying?
Well, let's say like anime is very much like that too, where they bring in specialists who do very specific things. And there's one animator who's known for his explosions, and so he can make anything blow up. And his specialty is everything breaks up into blocks.
Okay.
And so it's funny because you'll watch something like Space Dandy, which has two different directors, and so very stylistically, like one of the directors is the same director as Cowboy Bebop, sure. And so, but they're very different stylistically, and which is great because you're watching an episode, then another one will look completely different.
I've only seen one episode, so I should dig in more.
Oh, I loved it, and it's funny because I mean the conceit of it isn't giving away it's old, but is that he can't die. And so I read one review online, and the guy, so he reviewed the entire series, even though he only watched one episode. And he says, well, a show will never work if a character can never die. For one that's so lazy. It's so lazy that he just completely glossed over an entire series.
It also feels like, I feel like that's a premise of a show. If you're just like, what's the show about? And you're like, a guy who can never die. Like, but I want to see that.
It's brilliant because as you go on, it becomes this really weird existential, just really thought-provoking series. So this character who seems really shallow at first, he's got like the Elvis hair, and all he cares about is how he looks, and he's always going to like the Hooters in space. But there's just so much more to him as you watch the series, and then you get to the end, and you're just like, whoa. Yeah, I definitely would recommend watching more of it for sure.
Okay, Space Dandy. I'll definitely check it out.
Yeah.
I remember hearing about Chinese type of Chinese art studio where they bring in a guy like this guy draws hair or hands really good, and they just have him do like close-up panels. I have no idea if there's any truth to that.
Validity, but that would be amazing.
Sometimes there's like comic bookish rumors that I hear about that are more exciting than the reality. Do you know about Pond Scum? Did you ever hear about that guy?
No.
There's a gentleman named Pond Scum who was basically like the fixer of New York comic books in the late 90s, early 2000s, and it would be like, oh no, this issue of Aquaman is not going to get done in time. You got to call Pond Scum, and he'd just show up and just bust out an issue in a weekend.
He's the fixer.
He's the fixer, exactly. He'd show up in a tuxedo, and I never met the guy, but there's certain guys that lived in New York in that era that you'll be like, Pond Scum, and they'll be like, Scummy, yeah. It's like I remember hearing my old roommate Filthy Rich worked he worked at DC Comics as a production guy, and he he apparently, one of the guys had a file of the worst submissions he'd ever gotten, and just yeah, there was a incredibly, he described it as incredibly beautifully rendered gay Casper, the friendly ghost porn comic that somebody sent to DC, which he thought was especially funny because DC doesn't call it Casper. And he remembered one line in it where Casper is getting a blowjob from a hobgoblin, and the dialogue is him saying, "Man, this hobgoblin sure knows knobgoblin," which is a panel I've redrawn just from this story.
And I'm sure the artist thought, this is the tagline. They're going to put this on the cover.
Yeah, I mean, this is not the first publicly broadcast thing that I've told that story on. So it's, and I wonder, and maybe someday someone will be like, "Oh yeah, no, it wasn't Casper. It was the devil guy," and I'm like, "Oh, that ruins it," you know?
No, yeah. Well, it is funny because there's all sorts of stories like there's a screenwriter in Vancouver, and I can't remember his name, and I mean, all he is a rewrite guy. Mm-hmm. I shouldn't say all he is. He's one of the go-to rewrite guys, and sometimes he gets credit, sometimes he doesn't, but he's a millionaire, you know, right. and that's his specialty. He comes in and he fixes scripts. It's interesting that, you know, like, talk about a specialty, you know, to be able to because I'm sure he's handed a pile of horrible notes from you know, studio execs, sure. And he has to make sense of them in terms of, okay, can I make this script work with all this nonsense that they just gave me? And to certain levels he does, because I mean, he's busy, he just keeps working, and that's it. Like, he's right. I don't know if he's writing original material outside of that or not, but he's hugely successful. He lives on the North Shore somewhere, but we've really gone down a different rabbit hole.
Yeah, no, it's good.
But getting back to comics, so when's this? Do you have any idea when the new book's coming out?
I think the first month of next year.
Okay, cool.
Right after New Year's. Yeah, and my hope is that I can kind of just segue from that into another series afterwards. But I also like the idea of having work done so far ahead of time is really nice. Like, it's weird to be drawing pages now and just being like, this thing, no one will see the pages I'm drawing now until, you know, this time next year. It's very weird.
But that's a good feeling, though. I mean, so you're not up against those horrible deadlines where you're potentially having to turn out product you're not happy with.
Yeah, it's always a weird mix, because I feel like ideally I'm working slightly faster than I'd want to work, you know, because you don't want things to become too precious. Yeah. And sometimes I feel like you want to have pages sometimes where you take several days on it, but then you also want to have pages where you want to have days where you're like, oh, I did 2 pages today, because, you know, it's not that important. It's like I don't want kind of a uniform quality to my work, if that makes sense, per page. Like, I feel like some panels you want to have your money shot, your exceptional panels. Then you want to have just like, this is a good panel, you know? Yeah. But you don't want every page to be your Jeff Darrow thing, you know?
Well, and I mean, you sort of get numb to that after a while anyways. I mean, it becomes a conceit that you have to then push as a creator, and as a reader you expect. And then, so the only time you notice a switch is usually when it drops away, not when it's pushed higher. So that makes perfect sense.
And a lot of that is from me, like, realizing that I was developing kind of a formula to the way I did things. Like, in the end of Multiple Warheads, there was this point where I was like, I have ways to write jokes now. And I was like, I shouldn't just be plugging in the jokes in the spots that I think they should go. And so I started to develop these rules for myself, where I was like, taking a risk is always better than doing something I've done before. And doing something is always better than not doing something. So days that I do a page and it's not my best page, sometimes it's better to just be like, okay, the page after that has to be really good. Then it's worth scrapping that page and redoing it and making it perfect, because I'd rather have new 500-page book than a new 10-page book that's perfect, you know?
Well, and it is, and I've talked to a lot of creators about this idea of, and I talked to you about it, but just you and me, about pushing your ceiling, because we all have one, and our ceiling is, what we're capable of doing right now. Like, what is our best work? And with the idea of comics is that rarely do we get to push up against the ceiling, so we're getting better and raising the ceiling. We're sort of slotting in here, and and we are incrementally getting better within that space as we do work on a book, but we're not raising our level because we're not hitting our ceiling. Does that make sense?
Yeah, very much so. I feel like with my stuff, I feel like it's sometimes even less of a ceiling and more of just like I haven't tried this kind of thing yet. Let's move over here and do something slightly different.
Well, and it's really interesting because I'm working on a commission right now, and it's for that Dark Knight Returns project where a collector is getting different artists to do a different page.
Oh, I've heard about that. Really
for the first issue. Yeah, so I'm doing a page, and it's not the most exciting page, but those pages got to be done too.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, Dark Knight Returns is a seminal work in comics. It's brilliant. It's it's something that people go back to in terms of a standard for superhero books.
Yeah, no, it's certainly one of my favorite superhero comics ever made.
But what's been interesting breaking it down is that, especially with the page that I'm working on, it very much, speaking to what you said, is that, well, Frank was cranking out some pages, like he would have had to have. And the page that I'm working on is definitely one of those pages. And it's very sloppy. The layout is not interesting, very quick. And the thing that I showed Cam is, if I can find the photocopy, I'll show you. But it's the big panel with just I got it here.
Well, something I feel like it's probably like I'll probably step on someone's toes, but I think something that I've really admired about Frank Miller is he's not very good at drawing, but he's really good at telling a story.
His storytelling is impeccable. I don't think there's not many that are better than him. Right, and like his drawing is not his strength. Mm-hmm. But his writing and his storytelling definitely is. But this panel made me laugh because as I was working on it, so it's that shot. So it's just that page, and Bruce Wayne is watching TV, but he's supposed to have his legs crossed, but literally he's just holding up his left leg. That. Yeah. It's not over his knee. He's just holding it. What's that?
Can you show us that again? Sorry, I was trying to.
So he's just literally holding his left leg in the air.
That's amazing. But the amazing thing is it conveys that.
I know.
I've done similar work where I had somebody walking and I drew their legs wrong, and I was like, but it looks like walking. So I just kind of let myself get away with it. This is when I was like 19, but like it's kind of amazing because it's like it's hilarious if that was the cover, but it's also like I feel like he kind of gets away with it.
It does, and it's just the storytelling of it. I mean, he's clearly watching TV, he's relaxed, he's drinking. He's got the remote in one hand and glass in the other, and you just completely go, get past the notion that he's just holding his left leg up.
Hear me out though. I think because it's in the future, we can just assume that is he's got a footrest which is made out of part of Wonder Woman's invisible jet.
There you go. I suggested to Cam that perhaps there was some flatulence involved. But
that'd be great. Just he lifts up his leg and rips one in the shape of the bat signal.
But we should. But it is interesting. It's been really interesting, sort of working on this page. I'll show you what I have so far.
Are you choosing to change that, or are you keeping the leg?
No. I drew him with his legs crossed properly. I haven't inked that yet. So that's what I've done. So I did I stuck very closely, actually copied where his word balloons and everything were on the page. And the idea was to sort of tweak it a little bit, but because how the layouts were and the information was quite dense, there really wasn't too much to do. So I did a little bit more because these top panels are sort of very straight on or overhead, and I gave a little bit of more perspective to them. But
That's really nice.
yeah, so this is the page I was working from.
I read
But,
through there's a Fantastic Four issue that a collector was hiring a bunch of indie comic artists to redraw every page of, and I did one of those. I remember he had, I think Chester Brown was in it. And,
oh wow!
Maybe Nate Powell. It's just a little zine he put out of it. And there's also, is it called Stupid Dark Knight Returns?
Yes. Is it stupid or shitty Dark Knight Returns?
Yeah. Because I know Mafu did stuff in that one too, and he was telling me that like it was hard for him to just bang it out because he likes the stuff so much. So I think his pages look a little prettier than he wanted them to be.
Well, and it's interesting because I recently reread Dark Knight Returns. I hadn't read it for a while, and I mean it's fantastic. It's I mean, year one is still my favorite Batman story with Mazzucchelli and Frank Miller, but Dark Knight Returns is very popular for a reason. It's an incredible book. Yeah,
I think Dark Knight. It's funny because I know that Mazzucchelli's a much better illustrator than Miller, but Dark Knight. When I read Dark Knight, it was I read it out of order when I was like probably like 10 or something. So I was just super confused by old Superman and old Batman and how everyone was calling themselves by their first names.
How do they all know each other?
Yeah, or like I didn't like it would be one of these. It was this great thing where Green Arrow shows up in it, and I didn't realize it was Green Arrow for a year, so they just call him Ollie, and he has one arm. And then like I was probably like 30, and someone was like, "Oh, you know," they mentioned his real name or something. I was reading a comic, and I was like, "Holy shit, it's the guy from Batman!" I never made the connection.
That's fantastic.
That's a weird thing, kind of going back, is like I don't have a big wheelhouse of superhero comics. Mm-hmm. Like I read Spider-Man and I read Power Pack and New Mutants, but like outside of that, like I didn't really read DC stuff as a kid. I think some Omega Men issues or something. Oh, Ambush Bug I was really into, but it was really weird to. So I'll probably hit that point at some point when I actually start researching and reading all that stuff again.
Yeah, I went back and started reading some stuff. Like I really liked Dreadstar when I was younger.
Oh, Dreadstar is great, Jim Starlin.
Yeah, and Omega Men was an interesting book too. That was Keith Giffen, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's been kind of fun going back and reading stuff because I sort of dropped superhero stuff probably in my 20s. Maybe I got a little bit into my 30s with some stuff, but definitely wouldn't have gone in my mid 30s up. And really that stuff just sort of fell away as I started to read other stuff, independent stuff or reading manga, European stuff. And so it's been good to go back and read some of that older stuff. And some is great, and other stuff is like, no, there was a reason that this resonated with me because it's really good.
Sure.
And I've talked with other creators and even Cam about this, is that I think part of the reason that perhaps DC is faltering now, or however you want to perceive what's going on there now, is that there's who is the Frank Miller doing the Dark Knight at DC now? There isn't anyone.
Yeah, but it's difficult too, because would they let Frank Miller walk through the door and be Frank Miller now?
Probably not. No, because
it's difficult. Because it's like, like I know they're still in communication with Paul Pope, and I think he could do it. But it's funny. Pope's one of my favorite artists, and somebody who I almost regard as like he does good superhero comics, but I'm almost like, man, but those THB issues,
Yeah.
It's almost like some people I'm almost like, like there's a story about like how close Darwin Cook got to doing creator-owned work, and about how he kept just being like, oh, one more job.
That would, yeah. Well, his Parker books probably are as close to the creator-owned thing as you can get with it. Even though it's an IP, he's working from an existing property, but those Parker books are amazing. Mm-hmm. Amazing. They're just that black and white in one color, and how he really executed that. I should go back and read them now. Cam, have you ever read those?
No, I haven't.
Oh, they're good.
You know what I read recently that really blew me away? Speaking of Pope, is I finally dug out all the Wednesday Comics things, and he did the Adam Strange story in there.
Yeah.
And I expect it to be like, I like his stuff a lot, but I'm also get critical a lot of his work a lot because I hold it in such high regard, and that thing like blew away my expectations.
It was so dense. It read like Hal Foster or something like that, like Alex Raymond. Like it really, there's so much in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, those pages, it must be like this.
Yeah, because
big.
they printed this like newspaper thing they have to fold out, and it was funny because the first I got all of them for like a quarter a piece, and I did a read through where I just read Pope stuff and the John Arcudi Superman in there, spacing on the artist name on that one, but yeah, so I got to go back to them because there's a bunch of really fascinating stuff in there. I remember there's a really good looking Flash and Green Lantern story in there.
What's Paul working on these days? Is he doing comic stuff now?
Yeah, I think he's finishing up Battling Boy. I have a funny interaction with him where sometimes I'll just hit him up and like I'm obsessed with reading old interviews with him, and I'll read something that he wrote in 1995, and I'll literally just message him and just be like, "What do you think about this now?" And I get like the answers back that I deserve, where he's just like, "Dude, that was 20 years ago. Calm down." You know?
That's hilarious.
He's finishing up Battling Boy.
That's cool. I met him once, and it was at a friend's gathering. Wasn't really a party. I was just tickled that he knew who I was.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah.
It was years ago. But
I'm unsure if he knows that I'm the same person that he met, because I met him multiple times before anyone knew my work.
Okay. Well, you know him well enough to ask him, crazy out of context questions and have him respond. So,
Sure.
But yeah, no, he's one of those guys that, and it's funny, and I'm not, because he is amazing, and I'm not trying to, in a weird sort of roundabout way, pat myself on the back, but I get compared to him a lot, and I draw absolutely nothing like him, though. You think it makes sense? Because I don't get it at all.
If somebody said, we need someone to draw someone in a fur coat, I'd be like, get Troy and Paul.
Okay, well.
And they need to be in like they need to have a weird 1930s telephone. Like, okay, I know the guys.
There's two?
Yeah, I can't think. Like you two and like Al Columbia again.
Yeah. Well, I'm just excited that he has more work coming out too. So yeah.
Yeah, who else would you even get for that? I mean, there's guys that kind of skirt, and Pope has got a million kids, That's
like he does? Like he's
No, I just mean like artists that he's influenced. I always think of like how there's all the Mobius kids, and then there's like Dave, like the Rocketeer Dave Stevens guy.
Yeah.
He's got his whole hierarchy of like Adam Hughes and Frank Cho, and I shouldn't be doing this, but
it's true.
But yeah, there's the whole I think that's always really fascinating, kind of where people sit. Like I always think of like James Stokoe as like one of Darrow's kids.
Yeah.
And I think he'd be okay with that. Actually, I got a Darrow original because he did a Pinup and Profit once.
Oh,
and
that's
I gave it to Stokoe because Stokoe was like, he likes him so much that he was like uncomfortable talking to him. And hopefully they communicate more now. But
that's have you had that, like when you were younger, like where you met someone you really revere and you were so
It's always funny with me because the people that I hold in such high regard, like there's people like Pope that I was super influential in my work. I kind of avoided meeting Mobius my whole life while he was alive because it was almost too much. And Phil Barlow, who I mentioned before, who did Zooniverse and worked on all these cartoons in the 80s, like he's somebody who I liked so much that when I got to the position where I could like offer him work, I reached out to him, and then we became friends because of that. And then I actually got to go to Australia and give a talk at the Sydney Opera House with him, which was
I remember that.
incredibly cool.
Zooniverse, when Zooniverse came out from Eclipse, was Eclipse correct?
Mm-hmm.
Blew my mind. Like I thought for sure he had to be European.
Yeah, it's because it doesn't feel like anything else, and I feel like I think he was influenced a little bit by Rock and Roll, the Canadian animation.
I got that. You can get that on Blu-ray. I have that on Blu-ray.
Another guy that I always go back to is Matt Howarth.
Yeah.
Because he's one of those people that's like hugely influential on me, and no one talks about him.
Yeah, there are those people that sort of fall through the cracks, and you don't really know why. I've talked to people about about Toth, and who all creators over a certain age just, think he's a god, but
Sure.
he isn't sort of talked about in the same breath as a lot of other creators, and people sort of suppose it's because he never did a seminal run on something, because he just sort of worked project. He was just such a workhorse, but he never did like a huge run on like Fantastic Four or something like that.
Yeah, and I feel like his tap story is probably the Toad story.
The
one
tap
about the guy,
story.
Yeah, it's like a little guy tap dancing, and there's all these people with like question mark faces watching him.
Yeah, and he was, for sort of how rigid he apparently was sort of as a human being, because he was a big grump, but I mean, he was so expressive in his work and just really kept pushing what comics were. I mean, he really created a lot of language that is still used now that people probably don't even know came from him.
Oh, certainly, yeah. I actually have a box of Toth books that I did a cover for Rumble, and Arcudi paid me in Toth comics.
Oh, that's awesome.
Which is amazing.
That's really cool. Yeah, I did a Rumble cover too, which was a lot of fun. But he paid me in cash.
Cash is good too. I'm not
yes. But did he buy the cover from you afterward, or was that included in the box of Toth books?
I'm not sure. I might have given it to him, or he bought it or something. He's one of those people that's generous to a fault, and really
he is. Yes.
Yeah, I think I was mentioning before that I was funny. I was talking to him earlier today about Toth stuff, and I kept being like, imagine if Toth just did 50 pages of a guy brushing his teeth and buying groceries. Like, I would read the hell out of that comic book. And he was like, Alex wouldn't draw that. He's like, he was telling you this whole spiel about how he really needed my personal theory is I think Toth needed a dumb story to fix, is what he wanted. Like, he wants a Zorro comic where it's just like, it needs him to be great, and without him, it's just kind of like a Zorro comic.
Well, it's interesting with his work on Torpedo, where he did the first Torpedo story, but as they suggest that he wasn't happy with tonally and some of the themes. I mean, there's a lot of sexual assault in Torpedo that apparently he was not keen on. So
that's kind of turned me off to Torpedo too, because it is beautifully drawn.
I know it. Yeah, but it is. You're just like, I mean, it's beautiful, but it's like, oh my god, this is like, here we go. It's
I always related to like, there's like misogyny and homophobia in rap music, where like I have a very high tolerance for it, and then there's like this weird level you hit where you're like, oh, this guy really means it.
Oh yeah. We've gone past him creating a character to his real life.
Yeah, like this isn't just using the worst swears he could ever have. This guy's a dick. And and there's a weird because the Torpedo books are kind of mean.
They are mean. Yeah. But Jordy is such an amazing artist, and you sort of trying to, justify why you're reading these stories. But it's interesting where, once again, with comics, you sort of seem to be able to push things further sometimes, but not all the time. Like you talk about like Batman's, Bruce Wayne's penis a while back, and everyone. Yeah, and everyone everyone lost their mind. It's like, well, these are adult versions of.
Not to get too into dumb Twitter stuff, but I feel like there's people that professionally just like look to things to complain about, and if Batman's penis is there, they're going to shine the bat signal on it.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Probably not even that book's fault.
Well, they get up in the morning and they're like, "What's going to piss me off today?" It's
Batman's penis always in my window.
Yes, exactly. Well, we've been going at this for an hour and 40 now. We usually keep it around an hour and a half so people don't start to doze off. But yeah, did you? I did. The one thing I did ask you was before all this was for a book recommendation, because I like to have artists just recommend stuff that maybe people don't know about, maybe I don't know about. Did anything pop up for you?
initially I was thinking about Appleseed because it's such a but I feel like anyone who's ever been in the same room with me or seen a piece of paper I touched is like aware of how much I like Appleseed. But so something I've been really keen on lately is the idea of positive futures. So there's a genre that's a very untapped genre called solar punk, which is basically what it's like. It's like if steampunk was instead of or cyberpunk or any of those things were more focused on like being in line with like Earth. So I think something like Star Trek Next Generation is very much solar punk, where it's like showing the best of where humanity could go. And I've been really focusing on, like, every time I write something now, I'm just like, is there any solar punk in this? Is it because I feel like people need a positive future, and it's so amazing when you start to notice how hard it is in fiction to find a good future that you'd want to live in, because it's so easy to be like, 30 years after the war, we all have duck heads or whatever. It's just very easy to take the darkest version and be like, it's easy to find drama in darkness, but I think much more exceptional to find it in light.
Mm-hmm.
And so something interesting about Appleseed, to go back to that, is that it's kind of a post-apocalyptic thing where they build a perfect, or basically what would be a perfect society, and then Shiro focuses on what the problems would be in that society, which I think is kind of a weird mix of both sides. Because he's just like, sure, there'd be terrorists still, and it's just like, yeah, but you're creating artificial people that no longer have war. Why are we focusing on the like jerks?
Well, and it's I think he probably just couldn't help himself.
Yeah, and I think there's an aspect of that too, because it's like I'm always trying to just be like, oh, what's a fun story, and it's so hard to not like have negative things in it. Like I always think about how it's so easy to find comic books that are just riddled with violence, and so rare. I mean, sex is in comics a lot, but violence is there so much heavier.
Yes.
And if you have a really good life, hopefully you have more sex than violence.
You would hope that that's at least the ambition. And I think that's a very North American mentality, because you go over to, Europe, where Europeans have a much healthier idea of sex and are more open to it, and it's not quite so taboo. Well, it's not taboo at all, and over here, just the notion of a breast, something upsets people as positive as breastfeeding in public, and some people go absolutely mental.
Sure.
When a mother is feeding her child, it's bananas.
But I think it's interesting, kind of in what I was talking about before, about almost like training the reader. It's interesting to try to create an environment where, in a piece of work where you normalize things that you feel like should be normal. Mm-hmm. So I feel like I'm always kind of fighting with myself in my work to be like, this is what I'd like to have, but I'm such a product of my environment that I'm just like, I start at the dumbest place always, and then try to like slightly. Mobius talks a little bit about how he was part of these kind of new age groups where he would talk about it. They'd all talk about enlightenment and kind of becoming a better person. And he did a bunch of comic books where he was like, it's about a knight that like turns into a crystal at the end, and they just roll their eyes and be like, oh, Mobius, you'll never learn. And the idea that somebody who's like I regard as like in a more advanced place in their life than I think I'll achieve, having other people be like, you don't get it, is,
Well, and there's truth to that, and I loved his experimentation, and when he started doing those paintings that, those sort of very organic, wet paintings that were just sort of shapes, and it looks sort of like intestines, and
they look like cut open an amoeba or something.
Yeah, and I remember he was really reading. Obviously, he didn't tell me. He was really proud of these. He felt like he was really pushing himself in new areas and thought he was doing abstract paintings. And then he met abstract painters, and they're like, "There's nothing abstract about these at all."
Right. The cool thing is, I think he did something new.
Yeah,
which is more exciting.
Which I think was his ultimate conclusion. Is like, but I'm pushing myself in different areas. So even though it doesn't fall under, what abstract painters consider abstract, it's abstract for him.
Yeah, that's something that's really important, I think, to mention, is just the idea that you kind of have to regard what is a success for you, not what is a gigantic success for art, the medium, the world. Like sometimes you just go off in your own direction, and you finding your own path is worth so much more than trying to do the best Batman comic ever or whatever.
Exactly. Well, and it's what's interesting now with new, because what it was probably sort of the same for you when you first started coming up and wanting to do comics, is Marvel and DC was almost always the end game at the beginning. I want to draw comics. Yeah, but it was never right for me.
Right, it's definitely there, and part of me almost wishes, because I feel like I had chances to get in that into the pool, and I probably would have hated it, but part of me like regrets it because I don't think that's an option in my future anymore. But it's weird. When I was a kid, it's like starting doing comics, my goal was to work at. I really wanted to do books at Antarctic Press.
Oh, Ben Dunn.
Yeah, like Gold Digger was like if I could be where Fred Perry's at now, and so the idea that I would get published by Image was like cartoonish, and not even like farther along than I expected to be, like obviously on a financial level, sure, but also just not the direction I expected.
Well, and I guess you just sort of need to be, and if you have longevity in comics, you need to be organic. Like you need to be able to take a left turn when the left turn just hits you, or you're going to go off the cliff. If you don't have your eyes wide open, you're just going to get sort of passed by. And
sure.
The idea was that there was consistency of work and success that came with working at Marvel and DC. And for some people, sure, but it's like anything where you put all your eggs in one basket, usually doesn't end up working out for you. But if you're carving your own path, creating your own work, like I said, you go left, you go right, you just figure it out.
You can look at the histories of things and like imagine like Jack Kirby or Alan Moore if there was no one to dick them over,
Yeah.
And who knows, like maybe they needed, it's like nothing goes easy and smooth in a life. So it's like maybe they needed to have these bumpy spots or things that weren't ideal. I'd heard a theory recently that Jack Kirby worked so incredibly hard in his 40s when he kind of started Fantastic Four, all that stuff, because he'd gotten into debt working on a project that didn't quite work out previously to that. So he kind of like what we regard as like this, like it's like this renaissance of amazing work. Like I think it's I don't know if the validity of this, but the idea is that it might have just started out as him being like, shit, how do I pay off this debt right now, and what can I do to survive right now?
And it was probably just a work ethic that stayed with them the whole time. I mean, and it is interesting. Scams dogs. And it is interesting.
They're like, you're totally wrong about Kirby.
You guys don't know. The idea of work ethic and coming, you work from home, I work from home, and sitting in front of your desk every day, and it's like, okay, what am I doing today? I think that your ability, creator's ability to be able to do that and to make work like that is far more important than ability and skill, at whatever level you're at.
Showing up for work is so much more of an accomplishment than drawing the best picture ever once.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, there's the long list of creators who were amazingly talented and it just didn't happen for them. They either were burning bridges, missing deadlines, and they just kind of fell away. I mean, there's only so many companies you can work for, before all the editors know that you're not trustworthy. So,
sure.
Yeah, it takes that, I think, is one of the most important skills, is just being able to sit down and make yourself work.
Yeah, and it's a long conversation, but comic books is a very weird place because it very much straddles commercial art and personal work, or at least it can.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you can do incredibly personal work, but it has to be accessible in a way that like fine art doesn't necessarily need to, or poetry or things that kind of allow for more abstract.
Well, and I think that's due in part to the belief that comics aren't sophisticated. And so if you push beyond what people perceive comics to be, then they think you're just, you're punching out of your weight class,
It's interesting. When I used to do graffiti in my teens, there was always this attitude in it that if people veered too outside of the style and the technique used, it basically was not longer graffiti. Like if you did a mural and it was legal and you used this thing called cheat caps, if you use the wrong caps for it that are too easy to do good lines with, and you did it in a different style, and people would argue that that's not graffiti. And I wonder if that exists in comic books in a sense where if things get too, I don't know, because I do think if you lose accessibility, people like the readership kind of guides it. And my hope is always to like build a readership. Maybe I have and on a little bit, but build a readership that's there for what direction you take them in. And if you're like, I want to get weirder, then they're like right there with you.
Yeah, and I think that that's what's really important is recognizing. I think that if you're trying to be deliberately obtuse or deliberately whatever, I think that people can smell that from 100 miles away. But if you're putting in an effort to experiment because you're literally just trying to discover some new things, in your audience, you have an audience, I think they'll be there for you. You might not have everyone, but they'll be there for you. They want to see what you're doing. I mean, unless you're just sort of creating fluff stuff, then that's what they appreciate. And if you go in a completely different direction, they're like, what? But there's more depth to what you're doing. And so I think that you going in a different direction, people would be there. And I hope that too with, what I have planned to do, that the people that appreciate my work will be there to do the same, be like, oh, this is really, really out there, but it's interesting, it's engaging.
Yeah, it's interesting because it seems like each kind of creator gets their own bubble of what people expect from them. It'd be fascinating to take people in like outside. I remember I keep thinking there's a Jim Lee panel. Jim Lee did a comic book with a silent panel, and it blew me away when I saw it because the idea of a Jim Lee panel where it's just a woman lighting a cigarette was so outside of my expectations for him. Weird as that sounds, because I'm sure there's hundreds of those exist. So it's interesting, an individual artist, like what would me or you have to do for someone to be like, whoa, I didn't expect that from them.
Yeah, right. And that's it's kind of exciting. It's kind of, and I feel like I'm at a point now where I'm really, this sounds bananas because I've been at it for so long, but I feel like I'm really getting a grasp of the type of work that I want to do.
Sure.
And pushing myself to be good in my work, but feeling comfortable enough to push myself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And for me, a lot of it's just been like letting myself not try to impress the reader. If that like I'm my new series I've been working on, it's like I'm not doing jokes and I'm not always trying to do the weirdest thing. It's like sometimes its tone is more important than like letting me do a page that's just somebody walking through a dark room and not making it fun is hard. As weird as that sounds.
So can you tell us the name of it, or is that still?
Oh yeah, no, I've talked a little bit. I mean, it's called Rain Like Hammers.
Okay.
It's essentially, it's hard to describe because it's a lot going on in it, but the core of it is about the first issue is kind of a self-contained thing where there's a guy named Eugene who lives on a walking city, which is just like a desert planet that has these gigantic malls with elephant legs on them, basically, and they're walking around, and then something starts happening where the walking cities are getting destroyed and attacked by some kind of unknown force. And then the second issue goes to this guy who's like an infamous super criminal who's learned that a daughter of one of his associates has been pulled into kind of a Hunger Games style trial on this world that's a palace. And he goes to the palace world and ends up transferring his brain into the body of a genetically engineered butler that is on the thing. And so it's kind of the core of it is about him realizing that once he physically is in a different body, that his personality and his like chemistry is different, and he's kind of turning into a different person. That makes sense.
Through the whole series, or through this is that issue?
Yeah, through the series. It's basically about him figuring out who he was and where he wants to go next, and then it ties back into the first issue eventually.
See, that's excellent. I love that.
So it's a weird series, and it's like I've been working on it for 3 years maybe. So whenever I finished Multiple Warheads 2, I was kind of working out at the same time, and yeah, so it's become this very weird, and a lot of it's dealing with depression, like as an aspect of the story, and trying to talk about like this weird midlife crisis of what am I doing with my life and my career, and finding ways to like art therapy and into science fiction.
Mm-hmm.
So it's
Twitter's also a great place to see a lot of midlife crisis.
it's important to learn not to share. I was so open at certain points in my life, and now I'm just like, read the comics. You know?
That's kind of it, right? It's like the guys our age aren't really buying motorcycles and cars anymore. They're kind of jumping off cliffs on Twitter. It's really weird, but
oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's just, you know,
I'm to the point now where people will actually just be like, oh, this new round of people that got upset, that got in trouble in comics on Twitter, and I'm just like, if I knew them personally, they would have probably told me, but I don't even know, so that's good.
Yeah. It really, and that's the thing. It's just, you know, people are, you know, outraged, they're furious, they're this, that, and it's like, you know, you would never know unless you dipped your toe in the bluebird, you know. So
yeah, I mean, it's weird living in Portland and having this kind of feel like an eye of a storm right now, but then having my life be this just like, oh, I think I'll go buy Brussels sprouts today. You know, it's like, I feel like that's kind of my relationship to the comic community now. Is you're like, you know, it's just like you look on the horizon, there's a nuclear explosion, but then you're just like, you know, you're just picking flowers.
Yeah, it's just like, well, I hope it doesn't hit before I get this page done.
Yeah, or just, you know, not my horse, not my race.
Yeah, well, and that's totally fair, because, like, you know, like we were saying earlier, like I've always sort of felt a little bit on the outside, even though I've been doing it for so long. And you know, you're involved or uninvolved as much as you want. Like I said, like I always try to encourage younger cartoonists to not buy into this notion of the industry,
sure,
but the medium of comics. And so, you know, it's like, how do I break into comics? It's like, well, are you making comics now? Well, yes, I am. Are you putting them anywhere? Yeah, I'm putting them online. It's like, then you're in. Like, you're making comics.
And it's like the trick is like, how do you monetize that?
Yeah, like getting eyeballs on it is a whole other thing, and monetizing it is a whole other thing. But if you're making comics, then you're making comics.
Yeah, and also just getting to a point where, like, my old roommate Corey Lewis used to always say, you want to give people the impression that there's a cruise line leaving, and they want to be on it. I don't know if that relates to this at all, but I always think about it. But just like getting yourself to a point where like they need you more than you need them. Like if you do a Batman comic and people, the draw is Batman, then it's kind of not what you want. You want the draw to be you. And you want to be able to be having this like doing fun, exciting work that's so much cool stuff going on that people like can't help but look at it. You want to kind of be undeniable, I think is really important to aim for in your work.
Yeah, and I say just,
what's that?
I say 100%, like just really lean into who you are and what you want to do.
Yeah, and just kind of what you're excited to read.
Yeah,
and like try to make that, because that's different. And it's especially interesting now, like thinking about like what would feel right on the comic shelves, and what could you find online that would just like be really exciting to you. It becomes a more complicated question as I get older too, because it's like I've read so many thousands of comics now where it's like part of what I would like to see is just like what doesn't exist, you know, what have I never seen before.
And so to that end, like, are you creating your comics for you?
Yeah.
Because I do that too. Like I always say, people are like, well, who's your audience? Who do you make books for? And I'm like, the younger versions of me. That's
part of it, yeah. But also like, I feel like I'm also trying to make, like, I feel like I have an idea of, everything. I do a weekly Patreon where I just basically write like a a diary thing and write reviews of what I've been looking at and everything. And just for sanity's sake, I always write it to somebody, like often Farrell Dalrymple is the person I'm thinking of when I'm writing it. Because I'm like, Farrell reads my Patreon, he'll, and that way I don't over-explain everything. I'm not just like, well, you see, Richie Rich was a comic that came out in 1958. I just am like, Richie Rich.
Yeah.
And I feel like I have to do that with my work too, where it's like sometimes I just think of like, oh, these are the kind of people that I've talked to or friends that I know that enjoy my work, so I'm going to focus on that now. And it's been interesting. The woman that I'm dating now has actually read my comics for years before we ever started hanging out. That's been a really interesting insight into my own work, is me being like, what do you want to see from this? And her being like, well, when I first got into your work, this is what I liked about it.
Interesting. So was her perception of you accurate or not at all?
I like to tell her that I get away with more because she had a higher, it's like normally you go into a relationship with someone and you're just like, I like this person, it's here, and then they mess up and you're like, well, the reality of this person is,
Yeah.
But I feel like I showed up here because she knew my stuff and kind of had an idea of at least my like online persona.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting.
Yeah, that would be interesting. It's funny because my partner, before we got together, she hadn't read any of my comics, but she did see the movie I directed.
Oh yeah,
and thankfully enjoyed it.
Yeah, that's important.
Like, oh, that sucked. Go through the rest of our lives and her hating the movie I directed, but yeah, it's interesting dating someone who's kind of Googleable, if you know what I mean. It's just, you just can sort of have a peek under the hood and, not knowing how accurate it is.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, well, this is probably a good time to end it.
Yeah, I've talked to you guys ears off.
No, it's good. It's good.
Yeah, that was a great conversation. Thanks for coming on,
Yeah,
Brandon.
thanks a lot for having me.
That was awesome.
I didn't even talk about the commissions and things I'm working on, but
I was just about to say, so is your commission list open or closed at the moment?
I still have. Is that what you're saying, Cam?
Yeah. Wow. Full.
Yeah.
At the moment.
Yeah. No, I put a little pause on stuff because I'm finishing up this comic right now, but I've been trying to do a commission every week or two.
Nice.
And seeing the ones you're doing has been really a driving force too, because you do these things that I expect to be surrounded by like gold frames. And I'm like, oh.
I don't know what I'm doing to myself.
Yeah, but actually something really cool is the commissions that I got through Inky Knuckles have been like, I'm so excited to draw them because they're they're all really exciting, fun things to draw. Like one of the things is one of the requests was to do like what I would draw as a THP cover, and I immediately messaged Pope and was like, I'm going to do a fake THP cover.
He's like, cool.
So now I not only have like the person who commissioned it to try to impress, I'm like going to try to draw it to impress the creator too.
Yeah. THP is amazing. Yeah, I mean, and I've had a lot of leeway with my commissions, and even the people that sort of had something a little more specific. Like I haven't had anything where I'm like, oh god, I guess I got to do this one now. Everything's it has been a lot of fun going into, and there's been a lot of problem solving as I go in, and I'm like, okay, how am I going to tackle this one?
Yeah.
And really pushing the idea of creating depth and mood with a pen. And
you got to lie to yourself that it goes farther back than right in front of your face.
Yes. And so, it's been a lot of fun to challenge myself beyond actually what I thought I was capable of doing. So that's been cool.
Mm-hmm.
That's been a fun part of it.
Something I'm really excited about is research stuff too, as much as it just like I'm doing a Night Nurse commission, and there's a original 4-issue Night Nurse series that I'm going to read through like the night before I draw that thing, just so I'm like know the character and I've been doing something that actually has been really helpful. Is about a week before I do a commission, I'll just make a Photoshop document where I just paste in all of the reference that I think I might use for that. And then I'm not sitting around on the computer looking things up. I'm just like, look at this sheet for everything I need. And it just makes me work faster.
That's what my desktop looks like. It's just all commission folders.
Nice.
Where I've done all the
Do you do something similar?
Yeah, and it's. I mean, I've always done that. I've always been a big reference guy and research guy, and so with these commissions, like I'll go and look lighting references as well, and as much as I can find for what. So I always have a hard idea of what I want to do, and then I start to research stuff, and then I let the surprises that come up with the stuff that I find then help shape the final commission, like what it's going to be. It's like I have an idea for a background, and I'm like, oh no, like this vegetation reference is cooler than the one I was thinking of, or something like that.
That's something that's worth mentioning too. Is I don't know if I've talked about this before, but I really like writing to reference. Like if you find a really cool photograph and you're like right around being able to have that in a comic, I find to be a really fun way to work.
Yeah, like there's so much of it. It's just, I mean, Google is amazing for that, for sure.
Yeah, or even just like I did a thing once where I like if you like a really fun trick is getting a book by a photographer, like get a book of photographers' collected work and just be like, I have to make a comic book using this as reference.
Are you doing a Doctor Who piece?
Oh yeah, it's cartoonish to research Doctor Who because it's basically just like I gotta open up that old can of worms again because I'm a little too deep into that. Doctor Who's the one show that I leave on and able to draw the Tom Baker stuff.
Tom Baker, that's the stuff that I haven't watched a ton, but the Tom Baker stuff is the stuff that I like.
Yeah. So the cool thing is the commission I got is drawing the new Doctor Who, and I haven't watched those at all. So I've watched a little bit.
What's her name?
That's the thing. It's Doctor Who. No one knows her name.
No, but the actress. I was thinking of the actress name. I can't remember her name. I like her a lot, though.
Yeah,
nice.
She's awesome.
Yeah, because I really liked Capaldi a lot, but a lot of the episode writing wasn't as science fiction as I hoped for. So, yeah, I'm really looking forward to that.
That'll be fun. See, imagining you drawing Doctor Who, a Doctor Who world is
I've done a lot of sketchbook drawings of like Tom Baker and the warrior, the kind of tribal warrior woman.
And K9.
Yeah, K9's fantastic.
Doctor Who and his million-mile scarf.
Yeah. Apparently that was an accident. It was somebody who sewed a much longer scarf than they intended to, and so they were like, I guess it's science fiction now.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So yeah, Doctor Who is a very exciting thing to. It's one of those things like Star Trek or Doctor Who, or all those things where it's like such a formative big thing, and then you get back to it. Have we talked about Blake 7? I'm going to talk to you guys years off forever. But
yeah, you and I have. Yeah.
Yeah, that's always one of my go-tos. Yeah, I should probably let you guys, or else we're going to be talking about Harlan Ellison's earwax in the next hour.
We'll save that for part 2.
That's right.
The Brad and Graham chat. Yeah.
Well, thanks very much, Brandon and Cam, and then everyone who tuned in.
Yeah. Thanks, guys. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for the chat, guys. And Troy and I will be back on this a little more consistently. We just had lots going on the last few weeks, but there'll be plenty more art from both these fellas. I know the King City drop went off like wildfire, so that was good. Thanks.
Well, I might have to get on that. I didn't know about that. I might have to get on that.
Yeah, there's a ton of pages that sold. So yeah.
Oh yeah, the plan is to send Cameron kind of when I send off this next batch of pages, I'm going to just include a bunch of original. I'll go through and find some good originals and also when my new book comes out, I think we'll probably just send you some pages so we can, when the book is in stores, people can be using it as a catalog for any original art they want.
Yeah,
nice.
Sounds great.
Don't hang up, Brandon. Don't hang up when we let go, Brandon. That okay. Rossi is famous for that. Signing off when we sign off.
Just gone forever, and there's just a tumbleweed when you turn on things.
Awesome, guys. Well, have a good night.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.